I'm here as part of our regular series of interviews with prisoner Bill Noguera, who has spent 40 years on death row in San Quentin. Now, he has a book coming out on the subject we're going to go into today, which is The Penitentiary of Horror. These are all real supernatural tales that took place or are taking place inside the prison of San Quentin, and particularly on death row. There'll probably also be a TV series out on it. Now, I know there are some stories, Bill, that the publisher will want you to hold back for now until the book comes out. But what was the very first hint that you had after arriving at San Quentin that something supernatural might be going on there?
Well, as you mentioned, 40 years on death row gives you a bit of insight of how people respond to particular subjects. Everybody on death row is aware that there's a chance that they're going to die there. Even more of a chance to be murdered on the yard because of the violence that happens out there. And that didn't scare most of the convicts. What scared a lot of these guys, and they wouldn't want to talk about it, was what happened at night there. And some of the things that they saw happen, that they witnessed, and then the death of a death row inmate during that time span. Now, this is not something that just happened recently. San Quentin is the oldest prison in California. It is also the longest running, still active prison in the United States. 1852 it came to existence, and from its beginnings, there is ties to the paranormal and to the supernatural. What made me look at it in those terms was because I was the library researching books, because I was just reading everything I could about the prison and about just subject matter. And I came across a story that caught my attention, and that led to me beginning to research it and then finding a plethora of stories connected to death row and the paranormal.
Oh, I see. So actually you heard about it from reading something at the library, and then once word got out that you were doing research, then people started coming to you with some of what they'd heard.
Yeah, and it wasn't easy. Believe me when I tell you that these are hardened convicts. These are guys who have murdered people, and they came to me because I went to the yard. I have these guys' trust. I'd been on a normal yard there for decades. And when I began the research and I began to ask the questions, they began to come to me. The first person that actually came to me was a guard. He came to me because he saw something that scared the bejeebies out of him. And just prior to that, I had gone into the library and found a story about the original hangman, which is the person who was officially named.
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
The man who was named the executioner, the first official executioner at San Quentin. His name was Amos Lunt. And Amos Lunt killed a lot of people, a lot of convicts, by hanging them. But the story turned on him when a convict by the name of Jim Miller. And I know this is going to sound like completely fiction, but please look it up if you want and you'll find this guy. Jim Miller was a killer. He was a murderer and he was sentenced to death. The funny thing about Jim Miller was that he was a hunchback. And I promise you this is true. And because he was a hunchback, it took special measuring, special diagrams to really put a rope around his neck that would actually do the job of killing him. And Amos Lunt did this. He's an expert at it. Unfortunately, they miscalculated. And when they hung Jim Miller, his neck snapped, but it also decapitated him. And it made a huge uproar from the community in San Francisco. This is in the 1800s, and the papers wrote about it. But soon after this, Amos Lunt, the fearless executioner at San Quentin, begins to talk to his contemporaries, his co-workers, and he begins to tell them that this inmate, as well as other inmates, have come back, the ones that he has killed and executed, and that a shadow continues to hunt him and come for him. And he begins to really lose his sanity. He goes to his best friend Frank, who he tells his story to. He refuses to go to sleep because of fear of something coming for him. At some point, the warden goes to his wife, Amos Lunt's wife, and they get together and they realize that this guy is really breaking from reality, or something is hunting him at night. He ends up in the Napa State Hospital for the mentally insane, where Amos Lunt, a day to the day he executed this guy, Jim Miller, is found dead. And that really piqued my story, my interest in the story about San Quentin, and really where the prison, how it developed, how it became to be. And I found just so many connections to the paranormal, and the biggest one was the name San Quentin.
So yeah, this is really interesting, Bill. I can see why it piqued your interest. So do you know, or did they report what actual crimes did Jim Miller commit?
Well, he was a murderer. He broke into people's home. He killed a pair of people. He was also involved with a story, kind of like a relationship with an ex-wife. This guy was a killer, just a killer. He wasn't a rapist or a serial killer. He was just an ordinary straight killer. He wanted something, and you had it, and he would do whatever it took to take it, and if it required killing, he would do that.
Because it's interesting. It seems like his spirit is what is reportedly part of what's haunting the prison, because of what happened at his execution. But right, his is one of many. Yeah.
Well, remember, the prison itself has had more than 10,000 murders, execution, tortures, and deaths. 10,000. And of those, more than 600 had been just executions of men and women. So death row is really the spot where everything seems to be going on. There is 3 cemeteries at the prison. There is Boot Hill. There's one under the old hospital, and the third one happens to be under East Block, which is right now death row, and where I spent nearly 40 years of my life.
So that those cemeteries that are under the prison, were they older cemeteries that predated the prison? And
yes, absolutely. They were there because there were so many deaths on the grounds of the prison that they just made makeshift burial grounds for all these different people. Well, that is, of course, what you hear at first, but it's the story before the prison existed that really caught my attention, and I'll cover that when I return.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm back with Bill. Thanks, guys. That was a quick break. These calls are limited to 15 minutes. He gets pretty much an unlimited number of calls, but each one is limited to 15 minutes. Bill, I think we were talking about the history of the land where the prison is built.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's research into a book of this type. There's going to be skepticism. There's going to be people who believe it. But I wanted to give as many facts as I could, aside from the individual stories where a paranormal event happened. And by the way, in the book, each paranormal activity that happened, or paranormal element or circumstance, led directly to the death of a prisoner on death row. And I knew every one of these prisoners. The book talks about a number of other ones, but the ones that it focuses on mostly, and what the television series is going to be based on, is the ones that I knew personally. Every one of these prisoners, I knew them, and I saw them before they died. Now, of course, before all this happened, I was researching the prison. I wanted to know, like most paranormal activities, they're tied to some type of violent act, maybe a burial ground, maybe something with Native American burial ground of that sort, or a cemetery. Well, this prison has every one of those elements, and every time I read something about it, I couldn't believe that this has been out there all these years and no one's covered it. And that began to really pique my interest to maybe that the influence, the prison itself, where the land is, maybe that has to do with part of why this has never been covered before. I learned from many sources that once they leave the prison, for some reason the memory begins to leave them. It doesn't become as relevant or prevalent in their minds. So I began to research further back to see what really happened at San Quentin, where San Quentin, the name, came from, and how the prison was established. And the first thing I found out was that San Quentin is a mistake. The word is actually Quentin, Quintin. Quentin was a Miwok, a coastal Miwok warrior, sub-chief, and shaman. And he and Marion, Chief Marion.
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Who is what Marin County is named after, were two guys, two Native Americans who were basically fighting for their way of life. The Spaniards had come in, they had began to torture Native Americans because they wanted to believe in Catholicism and turn them from hunters into farmers. And this guy rebelled. He was a very active rebellion type of guy, revolutionary guy. He fought for what he believed in, and he was placed in shackles, and he escaped. And then during this skirmish with Mexican and Spaniards at that peninsula, which is now San Quentin, he, along with many warriors, had their last battle, and he was defeated. He had superior firepower. He had arrows and sticks and, really primitive tools to fight with. And instead of them just killing him, they held him down, so he had to watch all of his warriors be executed at that location. He was then taken to a Marin mission and tied, where he was shackled and tied there until he escaped. And then the story gets a little weird, because people say he continued raiding and killing and stealing cattle. Other stories say that he went back to the peninsula, and there, as a shaman, performed the ritual of death in order to send his warriors to the next life in a proper Miwok fashion. Well, others state that that was actually not the ritual of death, but a ritual to open a portal to bring them back. So that was 1824, and for a while the peninsula went dead. No action, nothing happened there. Well, in 1849, this is during the time of the gold rush, a committee renamed the point, or the peninsula, Punta de Quentin, which means Point of Quentin, named after him. In 1851, another committee came back and renamed it, but they really made a mistake. They believed that Quentin was a saint, so they put the name San in front of his name, and they misspelled it. Instead of Quintin, they called it Quentin, San Quentin, and that's how the name was born. It comes from him. But from the very beginning, Kevin, really strange happenings happened at that location when a guy by the name of General Estill, James Estill, a Kentuckian, he was a congressman, a senator, he buys the land to basically enslave prisoners and get them to labor for him so he can make money. And from there, things really get weird.
So when was the first prison built there?
It was in 1852. It really wasn't a prison. It was a ship called the Womban. It was anchored right there at that point. And actually, it was supposed to be at Angel Island. That's where the prison was supposed to be built. But mysteriously, the barge, the ship, the Womban, was they were set to drift, and it drifted all the way to Point St. Quentin and landed there. And, there's a lot of back and forth. There were land grants, there was fighting, there was cheating, but ultimately Estill buys the land to put the prison there. And from the very beginning, When I speak about this influence, this is the influence I'm talking about. The Stones was the first building built there. And from the very beginning, Estill began to change. He began to torture prisoners. He performed these tortures on them from a thing called the gray mare. They would tie men down there, whip them on an apparatus called the ladder, and the gray mare was another apparatus where they would put a power hose in his mouth and his nose to drown him, basically. Later on, there was another torture device called the appliance, where they would just tighten.
This call and/or telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Like a boa constrictor and break the inmate's bones. All these things James Estill did. And people said he changed. That from being a senator and a congressman and a militia general, he turned into a very evil man. Not only did he torture him, but he murdered them. And the state of California began to look into the records, and they found that 99 inmates had been murdered. That's where the first cemetery came from. He made the cemetery, and he filled it with bodies. Things got so bad that people said he was possessed. And the governor of California actually came to the prison and under gunpoint escorted him off the grounds in shackles. Wow. And this did not only happen to the first warden, but it happened to a guy by the name of Tompkin, another warden. And they say he was 10 times more brutal than Estill was. But it has all to do with the land, with the burial ground, with an influence, a demonic possession that exists there even today.
Yeah, so something that corrupts people with that kind of power. So the warden would have the most power, but perhaps even the guards too, that corrupts their spirit in kind of a way and turns them towards evil or sadistic behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if you look up paranormal activities, poltergeists, and all these different elements, it usually happens at a hotel, maybe an institute for the mentally insane where maybe a murder happened, or a house where someone was brutally killed. Okay? So now multiply that by 1 million times. You have San Quentin prison where you have executions, murders, plotting, you have torture, you have fear. And it's not happened for a night or 2 nights. It's happened for more than 172 years because the prison's been in existence since 1852. So think about the kind of trauma, the type of influence that lives there, and then compile it with Quentin opening what people believe was a portal, and something is using that portal to get in. And what does it have? It has a perfect place. A place built on fear. A place that has a 15-foot wall surrounding it that has its victims all inside the prison.
Right, and obviously even just the hundreds of warriors that were slaughtered there before by the Mexican Spanish army that battled Quentin. So like you said, there's a lot of suffering, and whatever he was, he left a powerful enough impression that the area, his name lingered, and they adopted his name, and the Catholic Church adopted it and made him a saint. But he obviously had a powerful, whatever happened there, he was a powerful figure, and a lot of people got slaughtered. So that memory remains in the land, I would say. I think that's part of what you're saying anyways.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there are specific cases, and if you'd like, I'd give you and the audience a particular story about an individual. He's mentioned in the book, and his story does resonate in what we believe will be the second season of the television series. His name is Jacob Oppenheimer, and Jacob Oppenheimer was a murderer, a killer, but he really didn't turn into one till he came to San Quentin and something seemed to possess him. So if you'd like, I can tell you his story, and the audience is free to look him up. He is a central figure in the history of San Quentin and the incredible feats of violence that he was able to perform. And many people spoke about him being possessed to be able to accomplish these feats.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to that on the next 15-minute call. I actually want to get to the story that the guard told you, the very first guard that came and gave you some information, because that's a story that happened to a prisoner that you knew. So that's a very up and personal story that I'd like to get from you, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So the inmate we're talking about is Marcelino Ramos. Marcelino Ramos was on San Quentin's death row. I knew him since 1985 until his death. And Marcelino Ramos had robbed a Taco Bell, and he actually worked there as a janitor at one time. And he ended up by robbing the place and then murdering one of the kids. He tried to kill them both, but the gun he had with a rifle that he shot the young boy behind the neck and behind the earlobe didn't go through his brain, so he survived. So he went to death row for the murder of a young lady as well as the attempted murder of this young man. And the story that I got from him, I wasn't looking for the stories. I didn't know it existed, but a guard by the name of Morris, and he is a former sniper. He was in the Desert Storm Wars. He was a decorated sniper with...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
One day showed up at my cell late at night while I was painting, and he asked, "Are you actually writing a story about the prison and the paranormal that's happened here?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Then I got a story for you." And I sat at the end of the bunk with a pencil and a piece of paper as he told this story, which I will reveal when I come back.
Okay, we're back. All right, I'm back with Bill. When we just left him, he's in his cell. It's 1 a.m. and he's painting, which he was known to do. Bill, in case the audience doesn't know it, is a successful artist, a talent that he discovered and developed in jail. And his artwork has been featured in galleries from New York to Paris to London. So, Bill, you're in your cell, you're painting at 1 a.m., and a guard comes to tell you his story.
Yeah, he does. And as I mentioned, he's a decorated armed forces guy, sniper with many kills. And he really just comes up to me, asks me if I'm actually writing this book, that he had heard a rumor from these two inmates that were talking, because I had already put it out there that I was interested in these stories. And the stories began to trickle in. He was the first. And the strange thing was, as soon as he came to my cell, he said, "Look," and then I asked him, "Why are you off the gun row?" Because he's never off the gun row. He works a certain time. And he said, "Look, I want to talk to you. I took the day, I swapped with someone. I wanted to come talk to you." And he seemed very nervous. And I said, "Okay, great." And as he did, I said, "Great." He pulls out a mirror from his pocket, and he looks down the tier through the mirror. And then he looks the other way with the mirror. And he puts it back in his pocket. And I look at him and I say, and I took a wild shot, because I had heard little bits of stories from guys who had sent things to me. So I told him, "You can't see it without a mirror, can you?" And immediately his eyes locked on me. And he said, "You've seen it." And I said, "Listen, I think you better tell me your story." And then he begins to tell me that he's been working on the gun rail, which I know for years. And while on the gun rail, late at night, he suddenly feels very cold. There is frost coming out of his mouth, and it's summertime. This shouldn't be happening. And as that happens, he begins to feel an enormous fear come over him. He feels like a child almost, like he wants to start crying. He doesn't understand what's going on. But as he looks down, there are pipes that run all the way up and down the gun rail. And they're kind of polished out. They're galvanized pipes. And in the pipe, on the reflection, he can see something moving. He looks at the gun rail, but he sees nothing. He looks back at the pipe, and once again he sees something dark moving across the pipe. And once he notices it, it gets closer. He notices the lights on the tier are dimming as it progresses towards him. And now he's telling me that he is in fear of his life. He's been in war. He's been in situations where criminals are about to kill him, and he never felt the childlike fear that had gripped him. So he says that the shadow, what he describes as a tall, elongated, human-like figure without any features. He says that it pauses in front of the cell and then suddenly enters. And then he hears the distinctive sound of a person crying, like a child. He is unmoving. He cannot move. He is frozen to a spot because of the enormity of the fear that he's feeling. But a few minutes later, he sees what he believes is a shadow figure leave the cell and progress down the opposite side of the tier, the lights coming back on.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And the coldness leaving. He's able to get up after a few moments, and he walks towards the cell where he saw this thing go into, and he finds an inmate what looks like he's sleeping. So he leaves. He says that this bothers him a lot. He doesn't know what to think of it, but when he leaves the next day, it doesn't bother him as much. He gets home, he's basically almost forgot it. But he remembers enough to go into his locker and open up his duffel bag that he hasn't opened since he left Desert Storm. And he reaches, he's looking for something, and when his hand grips it, he pulls it out, and it's his reflective mirror, a mirror that he used in the field to bring down planes or to signal his planes of his troops so he knew where he was at while he was in the field of sniper. He returns to the prison armed with that, and he waits. He waits a week, he waits a month, nothing happens. It's about a month and a half later that while he's in the gun room, he's basically forgot about it. He thinks it's just his imagination. Once again, that fear hits him. This time, he reaches in his pocket, hoping it's still there. He doesn't remember if he's put it in his pocket or not, but his fingers find the mirror, and he pulls it out. And he begins to start searching the tears through the mirror. And there is where he finds the dark figure. But now he can see it. It's a clear mirror, and he's looking at it, and now he sees exactly what it was that he saw. It is approximately 7-foot tall, elongated shadow with looks like arms and legs, but it's very long. It's almost deformed, but it's traveling down the tier. Lights are dimming, and once again it pauses. This time it goes into a guy by the name of Marcelino Ramos' cell.
Oh, so the first. I'm sorry. The first. Didn't mean to interrupt you, Bill. So the first victim was a different guy. Was a different prisoner.
It was a different person. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Yeah.
And maybe it found something it didn't like.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, it honed in on Marcelo Ramos, and it entered his cell. And he said that the childlike screams and muffled cries made his skin crawl. And he didn't know what to do, but now he knows what he's looking at. Again, a few minutes later, the crying stops. And the figure leaves the cell again. When it leaves, this time, Moore stands and walks over and looks into the cell, and he finds the inmate sitting up, and he is shaking. He's looking straight ahead. He's wide awake, but he's shaking. He doesn't know what to feel, doesn't know what to think, so he walks to the front of the unit and sits down next to all the other officers there. He's afraid. He doesn't know what to do. He's never seen anything like this before. He's never heard of anything. He goes back home, he researches, he finds out a few things about the prison, but there's not a whole lot. There's nothing there about the paranormal. So he returns.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And it happens again. The figure comes down the tier. It enters the guy's cell, Marcelo Ramos. But this time, Morris has the stones to stand. On shaky legs, he walks towards the cell. This is late at night. It's 1:30, 2 in the morning. And this time he looks in the cell, what he sees turns his blood to ice. There on the bunk is Marcelo Ramos. He has his hands up, which he looks like he's asleep, but his hands are up like trying to push something off of him. But there's nothing there. So Morris pulls the mirror out from his pocket and looks into the mirror, and what he sees stops his heart. There on top of him is this black figure, this hooded black shadow. It has its face close to Ramos's face, and it looks like it's either breathing deeply or absorbing or maybe even drinking from him. It's what it looks like. He can't tell because when he looks to the mirror, the shadow is covering Ramos. When he stops looking to the mirror, all he sees is Ramos. He doesn't see the figure. He is scared. He doesn't know what to do. Does he call staff? What does he do? What does he tell them? I saw a shadow feeding from an inmate. He goes back to his place and sits down. But this time, what happens really shocks him. When the figure leaves the cell this time, it begins to walk towards Morris, not away from him. And now the figure is walking. It now has taken on the form of a large in-law native, but it looks like a man now. He has arms, he has legs, and he's walking instead of floating across the tier. The lights are dimming faster and darker, and when it reaches the plateau in the second tier right next to the gunrail, it stops and looks directly at Morris. And the fear that grips him makes him nearly wet his pants. This is a warrior, a man who is killed for a living, but he's shocked. He doesn't know what to think, and then it just turns to attention and leaves. Now he pauses telling me this story, and he looks at me and he tells me, I think the reason it saw me was because I've killed before. It always kills people who have killed. Now this is his assumption. I later researched it more and found this to be true. The things that happen on death row seem to be tied to a person who is killed. If you have killed, you're receptive to its influences. If you haven't killed, it doesn't seem to bother you. Mm-hmm. So Morris leaves the prison. It's a weekend. When he returns Monday, he gets the shock of his life. When he's coming in, because he's interested in seeing what's happening, he's armed with his mirror, and he wants to see where this takes him, he finds that the cell, Ramos' cell, is covered. It's covered with red, like the tape that you see around a crime scene. Mm-hmm. He immediately goes to the front of the unit, and he asks, what happened to the inmate? And they said, oh, man, he died. They found him dead. He rushes back, he checks the report, he reads it. Suppose he dies of natural causes. But he knows better, because the day before he left on his day off, he had witnessed Ramos fishing. And that's what's called fishing, is when you have someone off a higher tier send a line, you hook it with another hook, and you bring it into your cell. Ramos was selling his CDs, his radio, his television, anything he can get his hands on in order to buy from a drug dealer methamphetamines to keep him awake. But he witnessed that little by little he lost all his items because Ramos knew that something was coming from him. He didn't know what it was, but something was coming for him. And he was buying the drug to stay awake because he knew that when he went to sleep, it would come for him. And that's exactly what happened. He lost his fan, He lost his radio, his TV, and every item he had in his cell. His cell was just bare at the very end. But he fought as much as he could against whatever was coming for him until it killed him. Morris stops telling me the story, and I thanked him for it. I mean, it sent shivers up my body, and then what he told me last really shocked me. He said, Noguera, I wanted to tell you a story, but the real reason I came to tell you the story was to warn you. I said, well, what's going on? He said, that thing was looking at you last night. And then he left. He left me with that impression that that thing was looking at me the night before.
So we have about a minute left on this call, and then we'll pick up again. But I wanted, so in your time there, and you've killed, so this thing, that would be why it might be attracted to you. Have you felt its presence or anything similar to that?
I have felt a coldness.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
I have felt coldness. I have felt something watching me. I have seen with my peripheral vision, I've seen something move. But I personally have never seen this shadow that actually returned to take the life of other prisoners as well.
Okay, I'm back with Bill Noguera, and we're talking about this strange 7 foot tall, kind of a silhouette kind of character, shadow creature that is feeding on killers, and it seems to grow in strength as it feeds. It probably can't maintain that strength, but it seems to grow more substantial. It fleshes out its human form just a little bit more and becomes a little bit more aware of what's going on around it. So, for instance, after it fed, it was better able to detect that it was being watched by the guard. Morris was his name. So, Bill, I wanted to talk. Do you have any theories on the childlike crying that was coming out of the cells?
Well, yes, I believe it was exactly that. The convict, Marcelino Ramos, cried. In his sleep, he was crying. He was being terrified. I think that this thing feeds on terror. It feeds on memories. It feeds on the essence of the killer because he is a killer. And, it's really interesting because this happens several times. It's not the only story in the book, San Quentin Penitentiary of Horror. It is one of many stories. We have demon possession, we have ghost hauntings, we have serial killers who come back and after being executed. There are a lot of different things going on in the book, but with this particular shadow creature, which a lot of people spoke about, I interviewed over 106 guys on the row, and when I say the row, I mean death row, and a lot of them had bits and pieces about seeing something very similar to this. And they told me, a couple of people told me that when they dreamt, they felt that it may have been there, and they cried because they were in terror. They were in fear for their life, and that it made them look like a child. It made them feel like a child. And they felt vulnerable. They felt helpless. So all of these things gripped them, as well as the overwhelming terror that this brought to them. As I mentioned, Morris said he was glued to his seat. He couldn't move. He was so afraid. And it wasn't feeding on him. Now imagine what the convict was experiencing when this thing is feeding on him. And I think fear is what it likes.
And so the guard had observed it on 3 different occasions, twice going to Ramos, right?
I believe it was, yes, twice. And a third time he witnessed Ramos searching for methamphetamines to stay awake because it knew it was coming. So this is, this is unprecedented, untold stories that happen within the walls of San Quentin's death row, and no one has these stories or talked about them because no one's been there as long as I have. Right.
And I can see, for something like this to come out, you generally need a journalist or an author, but in the prison, you have guards and prisoners. So it's hard to find authors and journalists out of that. You're kind of a unique exception to that, where you're able to write your own books and do so very intelligently. So it's not surprising to me that you would have this great source of stories there, but that nobody puts them together because it's just hard for normal authors to get access to it. if that makes sense to you.
Well, that and the fact that killers or men in general don't like to talk about things that scare them. And for them to feel vulnerable enough to talk about these stories, they have to trust the person. There's not a journalist alive or anybody there that's going to talk about these things to a person that is not a person that they're acquainted with, a person they've known for years, and a person that they don't feel badly about telling them that they were afraid. Because the person that I got the story from was the person living usually right next door to the person that the paranormal activity focused on and ultimately killed.
So you also talked about the memory loss aspect of this. Is this just another part of people being reluctant to talk about it, or being reluctant to even face it in their own minds? Or is there something actually possibly supernatural going on, that where people do experience some memory loss about the event?
Yeah, it's very possible. Every person I spoke to that left the prison seemed to feel that the further they went from the prison, the less the influence gripped them, and the memory seemed to fade. Not completely, but it became less important to talk about, or less pressing on their mind. When they returned to the prison, of course, it was right there alive and well.
Do you think, now you've mentioned that, well, the guard saw it outside your cell, and so he tried to warn you, and you have experienced the fear of that feeling of something that you can't quite see being nearby. But do you think it's fed on you at all?
I don't think so. I really don't think so. If it had, I have no memory of it. But look, I don't know the reason why. I seem to be a bit immune to this type of...
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
To this type of phenomena. I've lived very close to some of the people that actually died, and I did not feel like I was ever in danger. Look, I spent nearly 40 years there, and I basically walked those halls with no fear. Of course, any person had a bit of reluctancy of being around all these killers all their lives. There were serial killers and brutal prison killers, which are the convicts who actually do deeds within the prison. And I never felt where something was hunting me or that I was in complete danger. Again, I'm somehow immune to it. I don't know why. I'm very focused on what I do. I'm very observant of everything around me. I am a student of human behavior, and I think because of the intellectual aspect of how I look at things, maybe that gives me a bit of a buffer between what really happens and the actual events.
And also, for if there is a creature, an entity that feeds on fear, if you're able to conquer that fear largely in yourself, you may not really be quite on its menu in the sense, you're not producing the kind of fear that it requires.
Yeah, and look, there's a different points. There's more than 750 men on death row now. Since death row in 1970, it was reactivated in the Briggs Initiative. There's been over 1,800 men sentenced to death. Now, not all of those men have felt or seen or witnessed anything of paranormal element, but a lot have. And as I said, 106 people talked about it. How many more saw something but actually were too afraid to talk about it?
We talked about in the more recent episode on Richard Ramirez, doing the research. He did have a lot of supernatural beliefs. He obviously he's known for worshiping the occult and Satan, but also one of his victims, he had tried to strangle her with a live cord. And when the cord, she already was unconscious, he had hit her. And when the cord sparked because it was plugged in, it actually saved her life because he strangely thought it was Jesus intervening and then fled, and then the girl survived to kind of tell her story. So I wonder if Ramirez might have had any, because he would have felt that kind of fear because he believed in the occult. I wonder if he had any experiences with this, or if you've heard of anything like that.
Well, I will give you a hint about it because it is one of the stories in the book. There is a story by Richard Ramirez in the book, and it involves the paranormal. It involves another individual who experienced it, and I won't tell you too much, only that Richard Ramirez, after his death, returns.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, we can just about finish here. I can say that in my conversations with Bill privately, both of us are kind of skeptical by nature on these things. But that doesn't mean, when you're skeptical and then you experience something that's very unusual, such as a guard telling you that, you're still skeptical, but you still, then at the same time, you have to be open to things that are going on in the world. And I think that would probably be, that's how I would describe my approach. And I think that's how Bill's approach has been to this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I like to look at things in a reasonable, common sense type of way. But of course, there are things that I cannot explain. There are things in this world that most of us can't explain that happened. Is paranormal activity real? Is it something that can reach out and touch us? I believe so. And I believe that once the audience reads this book or starts hearing more of the stories that you and I are going to tell about these things and about San Quentin, they will be convinced that something supernatural, paranormal happens in that prison each and every day.
Okay. And now Bill currently has an entertainment agent or entertainment company that has the rights to this series that he's pitching. But to my knowledge, no producers have bought it yet. It's still early in the pitching stages. So if you are a producer and you hear this and you're interested, reach out to us and we can get you in touch with the people who have the rights to it. Would that be an accurate way of saying it, Bill?
It is, and I really appreciate it. This is a story that if you like horror or you like paranormal nonfiction, and there are a lot of different shows on Netflix and on different places, this is the story. This is stories that you've never heard before. These are stories that are actual and factual. They can be looked up, and I think that it would be a very entertaining television series, one that would scare the bejeebies out of you, but also entertain you because of the characters that are involved. As I mentioned, Richard Ramirez, the freeway killer, Justin Helzer. It's just a lot of people that people will recognize and the things that happen to them. And even more of a little bit of justice. It happens to actually a killer who people could kind of root for the entity that's doing this to them. So I guess justice is served in some ways, right?
Yes, absolutely. But there are sympathetic characters too, because you have the guards who are innocent, and they're taking this home with them, memories of it, and maybe even more. And it is, because it's a series that's based on true events, you can also fictionalize it a little bit. And I know one of the important characters that you have in the book, the main character is based is inspired by your own experience, but he has a connection to a boy that's on the outside and is possibly being haunted by similar forces here. So it's a high stakes TV series that's going to kind of like the X-Files set within San Quentin, but it will reach out to people on the outside too. So it's a really interesting series that I think will be very successful when somebody picks it up. Bill, I'll give you the last word.
Well, again, thank you so much for listening to Kevin and I's show. We really appreciate this. And as I always say, be safe, be aware of your surroundings. Your life could depend on it. We'll see you next time.